This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
So before we begin, allow me to introduce, let's take an opportunity to introduce Carissa Little, who you will be hearing from later today. Carissa Little is the Director for Professional Programs at the Stanford Center for Professional Development. She has been with Stanford University for 10 years and is responsible for collaborating with Stanford faculty, industry experts, and corporate partners to develop the professional and executive programs that extend Stanford to industry. She worked in both software and education prior to coming to Stanford. And now I'd like to turn over the floor to Professor Bob Sutton. Bob Sutton is a professor of management science and engineering in the Stanford Engineering School. Sutton is also co-founder of the Stanford Technology Venture Program and the new Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design, which is a multidisciplinary program at Stanford that teaches and spreads design thinking. He is an IDEO Fellow, member of the Institute of the Future's Board of Trustees, and a professor of organizational behavior at the Stanford School of Business. Sutton studies links between managerial knowledge and organizational action, innovation, and organizational performance. He has received many honors, including he was named one of the 10 B-School All-Stars by Business Week in 2007. So with that, let me turn it over to Professor Bob Sutton.
Thank you, Roni. Thank you, Roni. So I'd like to welcome everybody out there on your telephones, staring at your screens in various places in the world. And what we're going to do this morning is talk a little bit about the relationship between innovation and action. In particular, what I'm going to do is go through some ideas that I've been working on with various colleagues for years, notably Jeff Pfeffer, my buddy Huggy Rao, who's going to be doing the next webinar in November, and a host of doctoral students, especially a guy named Andy Hargadon. And let me start out and give you kind of what I would call a mental provisioning, a way of thinking that that I often use to frame the innovation process, both with my doctoral students and research crowds, and especially with the companies and managers and engineers that I work with. And it's a real simple formula that I stole from a business school professor named Charles O'Reilly, who's been studying innovation for a good 50 years. And Charles puts up this formula you'll see here. And it's this notion that if you want to innovate, you've got to have kind of a 1-2 punch of two things. First of all, and this is something that I talk about a lot in my various work, including the certificate program that you're going to be hearing about later. One is creativity, that somewhere or another you've got to get new ideas. Now, when we think of creativity, we tend to think that, well, there are ideas that we would develop ourselves or develop in our organization and our team. But one thing that I always like to emphasize is some of the most creative and innovative organizations get creativity in other ways. They copy it from other places, classic way to be creative. Even Steve Jobs was famous for saying that geniuses steal or something like that. They don't just borrow. You can rent it. Like there's creativity consulting firms. You can do a merger. There's lots of ways you can do creativity in addition to doing it yourself to bring something new to your organization or your team. But one thing that I like to say, and it's sort of like the hallmark of what we're going to talk about today, is you can have the best ideas in the world, but if you don't implement them, well, then they're fairly useless. So, at least useless to you. So what we're going to do is sort of dig into this notion, and in particular, I'm going to be drawing on some ideas from a book that my colleague Jeff Pfeffer and I wrote. You can see what I consider one of my ugliest book covers to the right. I can tell you a whole story about that as an aside if you want to hear it. So this is a book that Jeff Pfeffer and I wrote sort of at the height of the kind of the last dot-com boom, 1990s, late 1990s, that everybody was all breathless and hypey about everything and talking about what they were going to do. But one thing that we realized from working with the various companies, various clients that we worked with, is that knowing what to do is useless unless you actually do it. So to go back to the formula, in the case of creativity, you can have the most creative ideas in the world, but if you don't implement them in some way in your organization, they're actually, I would say, in some ways worse than useless because, well, you've got them, but they're just sort of just sitting there and not doing anything. And to give you sort of a quick example, which I always think is great fun. So here's a sort of silly picture. This is from the Stanford campus. This is, I'm thinking, well, about 8 years ago is when this happened. And as Roni mentioned, I'm one of the founders of something called the Hasso-Plattner Institute for Design, or a lot of people call it the Stanford D School. And our whole philosophy at the Stanford D School is do to think. So what we tend to do with our students is to sort of give them a kind of vague assignment and say, go out into the world and do something. So what we did was, for those of you who don't know about the Stanford campus, it's a large campus. Students ride their bicycles everywhere. And one of the hallmarks of the Stanford campus is there's actually a lot of bicycle accidents. In fact, there's a bicycle accident virtually every day, and about 70 people a year are injured badly enough that they go to the emergency room, and every now and then somebody gets major brain damage. So it's actually a serious problem on campus. And what we did was we sent our students out to try to improve bike safety on campus. Not to talk about it, their job was to actually do it. So what happened was that two student groups, and you see them pictured here, actually met at something called the intersection of death. That's what the students call it. It's kind of where two sort of downhill paths come together, and there's always pedestrians and students smashing into each other there at the intersection of death. When you show this to any Stanford student, they recognize it immediately. And they did two things. One of them came with these signs. You can see the folks at the bottom. And the other ones set up a roundabout, just old-fashioned sort of roundabout, which hadn't been there. And one thing I do love about Stanford, and maybe it's a little bit too precious, but in many universities, if the students showed up and did this, they would get in trouble. But there's a truck you can see in the background. That's actually the student, that's actually the Stanford police, and they decided they should help the students. So you have the police helping the students. So I've got this great video somewhere. The roundabout's working perfectly. Everybody's happy. They're going around it safely. All right. So they had proof of concept. So this is creativity. Now let's move to the next picture. The next picture is, it actually turns out, I'm happy to report, that there's a roundabout there. That's the good news. The bad news is that it took Stanford administration, and this was not for lack of money. It had to do with the bureaucratic issues. It had to do with it's not my job. It had to do with people talking. And it took about 7 years to actually put this thing in place. So sort of to go back and do our comparison, that's creativity, that's implementation, and this is really cute, but if you don't implement it, it's kind of fun, but it's kind of useless. So that's I guess sort of the message here. To give you another example more in the real world, and something that was much more expensive, some years back I worked with a large fast food chain that had a whole bunch of problems in terms of quality, service, and cleanliness. And what they did was that they hired one of those very expensive management consulting firms, and they paid several $1 million, and they had this report about all these things that they should do to improve their operations, to improve the way that they made the food, the way they recruited people, all the stuff. And so they have the presentation. Those of you who've been to these presentations, final presentations, they're presenting it. And there was an older guy in the back who raised his hand, and in his hand he had actually a pile of PowerPoint deck, and he said, it's sort of interesting that we bought virtually the same report from one of your competitors 10 years ago, and so the point is that they knew it, but they didn't do it. So that's another example. And to do just one more quick one, I'm sure you're getting the point by now. Some years back, McKinsey, the renowned consulting firm, did this study. This is mostly with some of their major clients. And they asked a question. For those of you who are familiar with Peter Drucker's work, one of Peter Drucker's main ideas is that managers should be accountable for the quality of their people. They should recruit them. They should develop them. They should fire and criticize them if necessary. And this is something that it's hard to disagree with. So they asked this question, should line managers be held accountable for the quality of their people? Well, 78% of the corporate officers of these large corporations said they should. 7% reported they actually did. So to us, this is a classic case of a knowing-doing gap, of a situation where you have some new ideas or some old ideas. This isn't all about creativity. And the question is, how do you turn that knowledge into action so you not only have, in the case of innovation, the creativity, but you also have the implementation? So what we're going to do in our remaining, 25, 30 minutes, whatever we have here, is I'm going to talk about ways to overcome knowing-doing gaps, situation where you have ideas, but you're not turning them into action. And these ideas, a lot of them are developed in the knowing-doing gap. In my new book, Good Boss, Bad Boss, there's actually a new chapter on the smart talk trap, and I talk about this stuff a lot on my blog as well. So that's sort of the theme we're going to dig into is how you overcome these problems, some of the root causes. All right, so let's start the first one, and this is the one that I've always had the most fun with. It's especially fun to talk to law firms and academics about this because we especially suffer from this problem. So these are situations where people know the right thing to do, but they use talk as a substitute for action. And let me tell you where my colleague Jeff Effer and I first sort of noticed this and got interested in this. So this would be back, I'm guessing, in about 2000. I had my first management consulting or my first consulting job with the top management team of a Fortune 200 company. So across my life, up to this point, I'd spent most of my time in academia and had done a fair amount of field research, but I'd never been led into those sort of sacred doors to see how the captains of industry perform their brilliant actions. And well, I'm a Stanford professor, and we're pretty inefficient in academia, so I figured these people would be much better. Well, at least the team I studied had incredibly weird dynamics, and I won't go into all of them, but one of the things they kept doing, which still amazes me, was they kept making these decisions, and they make the same ones over and over again, but they never would actually implement them. And probably, I guess, the worst or best example, depending on the way you put it, is they kept making the decision to put the name of their product on their product, but from what I can tell, they only implemented this decision about a year or two ago. And this is kind of a business-to-business kind of product, so it wasn't immediately pressing, but it was just amazing to me. And it's a sign that, if you will, that hollow talk means nothing. And it's also a sign for those of you out there, you should know, and you do know, that a decision by itself changes absolutely nothing. So my colleague Jeff Effer and I got quite interested in this question of, well, these were really smart people. If you looked at their resumes, man, they're well educated. They worked at the finest firms. They're paid, a couple of them, millions of dollars. What's going on? So why would smart people use talk as a substitute for action? And maybe in the Q&A we can talk about some of the details. But let me talk about at least two of the reasons. One of the first things is you can tell whether, sort of like immediately, whether somebody is a smart talker, and sort of like the moment you sort of have contact with them, if they're glib, if they're entertaining, if they're interesting, but whether they're actually good at turning into action is a different sort of thing. And on top of that, you've got this notion that talk happens now, and we're trapped in the perpetual present tense. It seems like action happens much later. Worse yet, there are some organizations, and I would nominate this as among them, and many teams, of course, where tomorrow never comes, where essentially the way that you get ahead in the organization is by saying smart things, not doing smart things. And since this is political season and we're listening to all the campaign promises, whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, or whatever else, they're all making promises right now, and the one thing we can be sure of is they're not going to keep most of them being politicians. And there's some systems that are a little bit like politics, that it's the promises you make and the plans you make that get you ahead. So that's the bad news. The good news is, okay, so what are the characteristics of leaders and organizations that link talk and action? So there's a couple of examples here on the slide, but to sort of back up to Silicon Valley, if you look at many of our famous present and past leaders, well, Steve Jobs, certainly, the late Steve Jobs is certainly one of them. Larry Ellison, Bill Gates, now chairman, but heavily, or at least heavily involved in his firm, still Ballmer. If you kind of go down the list, a weird one, Men's Warehouse, George Zimmer, one of our heroes, those who know who Men's Warehouse is, the folks who run Pixar, like John Lasseter. There's a wide range of personalities there, but all of them are the same in that they are deeply involved as both founders and technically competent people, or used to be in the case of Jobs, that they actually understand the work they're leading and therefore they're harder to fool. And to give you the two examples we're talking about here, one of the great turnarounds in American industry was done by Anne Mulcahy at Xerox. She's, to me, the anti-Carly Farina. I hope I'm not insulting anybody by saying that. But Anne grew up in Xerox. She was there for 25 years before she became CEO, and she really, really understood the details of the heart and soul of the company. And that, I believe, is one of the reasons that she was able to do such really a stunning job of turning around a nearly dead company. And conversely, there's sort of the question of, well, what do you do if you take over a company and you don't understand the technology, the people, and so on, or the customers? And a great example is Bill George, who's now a professor at Harvard Business School, but he had a few jobs before that, including being CEO of Medtronic, and he brought them from a $2 billion to a $60 billion company. And one of the cool things Bill did when he was president, before he was CEO, they brought him in, he spent 75% of his time, this is by his own report, I've talked about this several times, 75% of his time actually in hospitals, because this is a medical device company, talking to families, talking to surgeons, watching doctors implant the various Medtronic devices, doing all sorts of things that to understand the nature of the customers, the nature of the product that he was actually selling. And thank you. And okay, thank you very much. What, something just happened. Okay. All right. So that's one of the first causes of turning knowledge into action. The second sort of cure to when you're having trouble where there's a gap between knowing and doing is the complaint problem. Now, a little bit of what I would call recreational bitching every now and then is not a bad idea because we all have to let off steam. But when complaints reach the point where it's actually a sign of pure contempt, then it actually can be quite poisonous. And one of my favorite examples of an executive, or actually a manager who eliminated this, there's a woman who I did extensive interviews with some years back when we were writing The Knowing-Doing Gap, and her name is Annette Kyle. And Annette did this amazing job of turning around what was essentially a loading dock that was ran by something that was called the Celanese Corporation. It actually, they eventually covered it over, but for years she did a great turnaround. And what happened was that one morning she just got tired of all the complaints and all the whining and so on. So Anne, being a very action-oriented person, what she did was she snuck in the middle of the night, and there were 60 guys who worked for her, and she sewed, you can see the picture, these no whining patches on their fireproof uniforms that they wore, and she gathered together the people she led, these 60 sort of guys, and she said, so the amount of complaining that we have right now is actually quite poisonous, and we would appreciate if when something goes wrong, we being the management, if, number one, you could try to fix it yourself. Number two, if you can't fix it, come to us, management, and we will help you. And number three, if none of us can figure out how to fix it, let's not complain about it because it's just poison. And she said it was actually quite effective for stopping the complaints. So that's kind of like a second one, and it's kind of a cute one, but you really do need to be careful about creating and fueling a culture of complaint. Another point is simplicity. One of the things that I love during the period that our banking executives, to be negative, were running our financial system to the ground and didn't even understand the products that they were selling, many of them, or at least they claim not to understand them. If you look at their testimony to Congress, one of the most successful CEOs in the United States was a guy named A.G. Lafley, and his motto while he was running Procter & Gamble, he had a brilliant turnaround, was the idea of I keep it Sesame Street simple. And from having talked to A.G. several times, he always joked about what a boring CEO he was and how he would say the same thing over and over again until it was done. Things like the customer's boss would actually be an example of that. And to bring this down into a real situation of how this is also done, also related to this is the notion that simple strategies are easier to execute. There's quite a bit of research on organizational strategy, and one school of organizational strategy shows that, or argues that you should make your strategy as complicated as possible so your competitors can't copy it. But the problem with that logic is if you make it too complicated, your people can't understand it. And to give you an example, when Steve Jobs took over as then acting CEO in 1997, what he did was he walked around the company and he noticed they did this huge pile of hardware and software. And he asked questions like, why would I buy a Performa 5400 versus an 8600? And as the quote says, they couldn't even tell their friends which ones to buy. It was so complicated. So in Jobsian fashion, what he did was within a year, all of these products were gone, and he went to a simple 2x2 laptop, desktop, home office. And this was something that really helped with his execution. To bring this into the present day, and I hope I'm not insulting my friends from Hewlett-Packard, but I recently got on the Hewlett-Packard website and tried to figure out which printer to buy. I challenge anybody from Hewlett-Packard to get on the website and to try to understand the logic among the myriad of products that you folks have. You guys have to do something about this. It is a serious problem. So this is a problem that we see in an organization that's struggling right now, and it's something that I think they could fix. So that's the first point, this notion that to turn knowledge into action, you've got to find ways to bridge the gap between smart talk and smart action. It's about knowledge. It's about simplicity. It's about getting rid of the negative emotions. But that's not the only thing that interferes with turning knowledge into actions. Although in a lot of ways it's more fun to talk about the smart talk trap, one of the most important ones, and ones that we've seen in organizations over and over again, are situations where essentially friends turn into enemies. And if you look at the picture, what the picture is, it's like these guys are sort of beating themselves to death with these sticks in an attempt to get the carrots. And a lot of organizations unwittingly create a situation where instead of treating outside organizations as competitors, they treat one another as the enemy with the reward systems and other cultural elements. So let me give you one example from a now defunct company, but still one of my favorite and most amazing stories. There was a point about 2001 where a guy named James Halpin was CEO of CompUSA, and they brought him in, and he really believed that you should have competition. In fact, he had this great line at one point, which was, you should treat your coworkers like your enemy. And he actually enacted this philosophy. He did this sort of like amazing thing. He'd have these quarterly meetings of his regional managers. So these were the people to whom multiple stores reported to. And what he did do is he would sort of bring them into a room, and the first thing he would do, as the line says, he would actually draw a line down the table, the conference table, and if you were in the bottom half of products, of profits, you had to sit in front of the line because you had to listen to what he had to say. And so that's creating this sort of competition. And the other thing that he did was on their badges, like their badges, I don't know, I'm Joe Smith, I run the Atlanta region or something, he would put their shrink numbers, and that's lost and stolen inventory. And he said, oh, by the way, in the article that I got this from, he said that if you had good shrink numbers, you wouldn't talk to somebody with bad shrink numbers. They would be like a pariah. And if you think about this, well, the competition might energize people some, and I guess that's good. But the problem with it is that if you actually want learning and sharing your best practices and treating the company as joining the arms together in a whole, this is exactly not the way to do it. All right. So that's one example. Another, so in your own organization, or own life, so you may have seen this yourself. One of the organizations I worked with, they actually completely undermined very quickly the creativity on one team by having a boss who would give people cash bonuses for developing ideas in a brainstorming session, so they stopped cooperating, so you can do that very quickly. So what are some of the ways to avert internal competition? there's a great line, if you look at research by organizational sociologists, also a lot of theory too, that out-group threat creates in-group cooperation or bonds people together. So the notion of finding a common enemy is one of the most sort of constructive things you can do. We've got the example here of Firefox and Microsoft. Many of you will know, especially in the early days, now they're turning into a more normal company in some ways, although they're still a nonprofit, actually a nonprofit that's owned, a for-profit owned by a nonprofit. But anyhow, that Firefox, the open source browser, by sort of declaring war on Microsoft, it got everybody energized and sort of bonded together against the evil empire. Now, I don't think Microsoft's so evil and they're looking for other enemies, but this was straight out of the Steve Jobs playbook. He was always declaring enemy on other people as enemies, other companies. It was Google towards the end of his life. It was actually IBM early on in his career. He always had it was Disney at one point. He always had some enemy he was using to sort of bond people together. Another important thing for averting destructive internal competition is the question of sort of who you label and anoint as superstars. And on one hand, you could do something, a good example would be the old Merrill Lynch, where you literally reward people for stomping on others on the way to the top, where it's a zero-sum game, sort of almost like a car race where your job is to like push everybody out of the way and win. Or you can define a superstar as somebody who, if you will, not only has great individual performance, but also helps the other people around him or her succeed. And I've got a list of some of the companies I know, and I guess I've worked in one way or another with all these companies: IDEO, McKinsey, Procter & Gamble, Pixar, and GE. They have vastly different cultures. General Electric, for example, in a lot of ways is very competitive, internally competitive. But still, the people who are viewed as stars in all those companies are people who help others succeed rather than sort of like stand in their way. And a good example of this is A.G. Lafley had this philosophy of essentially that cooperation and information sharing were so important that he didn't even consider it in the compensation decisions. He simply wouldn't promote people who were too destructively internally competitive. And to give you a little racier example, actually just talk to this guy again. I talk to him about once a year, named Paul Purcell. So Paul Purcell is CEO of a company, it's a privately held company called Baird, very successful financial services company. They're doing fantastically well. And so some of you may know I wrote a book in 2007 and came out in paperback in 2010 called The No Asshole Rule. And I was just astounded to read in the Fortune Best Company to Work For list some years back that Paul Purcell believed the success of his company had to do with the no asshole rule. So I actually, within a couple of weeks, was on the phone with him, and he said, and this is a direct quote, he's approved it. I just heard him say it again last week. During the interview, I tell them if I discover they're an asshole, I'm going to fire them. But upon probing to Paul Purcell, and I just talked to him about this last week again, his perspective is that the people he wants to get rid of, it isn't just that they're impolite so much, it's the people who consistently put their own needs ahead of the organization, ahead of clients, and ahead of their coworkers. So again, this is consistent with this notion of sort of weeding out rotten apples. All right, so we've got one more sort of way to turn knowledge into action to avoid the problem of smart talk, and the smart talk trap. And one of the things that is a real hallmark of places that suffer from the smart talk trap, I'm actually thinking an example would be Citibank under John Reed years ago, is sometimes you have these leaders who always paint these grand visions and these incredible things that we're going to achieve. And that's actually an important part of motivating people, but where the failure occurs is when they don't focus on the little steps required to get there. And in fact, we've got quite a bit of research that when leaders don't do that, people freak out and freeze up because they're supposed to be doing these great things. They don't know how to get there. And in fact, there is a great book called The Progress Principle, which I recommend, by Teresa Mavles, the senior author. And essentially, in a very rigorous study, she showed that it's the little things that happen in the tiny moments in life that help people get ahead, not this idea of sort of like this idea of just painting the big hairy goals and then sort of leaving. And I think this point makes it as well, this notion that the best bosses sort of frame things as stepping stones or a series of small steps. And let me tell you a little story from a CEO I know who kind of sort of shows both sides of this. So this was in early 2009, and many of you will remember, and many of us are still affected by the financial meltdown, and a lot of companies, including here in Silicon Valley, were doing layoffs. In this company had a situation where, because of a bunch of financial problems, that the CEO and the CFO figured out that if they didn't have a sales campaign for their major product that was 30% better than the year before, that they were going to have to do a fairly massive layoff. And as I kind of implied earlier, I used to be under the delusion that the top management teams of large organizations were mature adults, but my experience with them has now dissuaded me from that. And this is an example. What happened was, after she presented this goal, they all started freaking out, yelling, and screaming at one another, and the room went out of control. And so what she did was she passed out Post-it notes, little Post-it notes, and she said, well, let's try to see if we can break this down. And she had them write on the Post-it notes the steps they would have to take in order for this campaign to be successful. And pretty soon, she had more than 100 Post-it notes, and she drew a line on the board, and she said, well, let's break them into easy ones and hard ones. So already she's broken down the big, hairy goal into steps, but to further break it down, she had them focus on the easy steps. And what happened was they calmed down and started talking about how they were going to accomplish those things, and within a couple of weeks, all those easy things were accomplished, and then they moved on and they made a lot of progress. This isn't sort of like a complete fairy tale. In the end, it turned out they had to do a moderate layoff, not a huge layoff. They almost hit their goals. Nonetheless, to me, that's a good sign of a boss who is, if you will, is moving from a big, hairy goal to breaking it down into small wins. All right, so we got a few here until we wrap up, and then maybe we'll do some questions and hear from Carissa. So a couple of sort of closing points. One is, and one thing that I like to joke is, I guess I've written 5, and I'm working on my 6th management book, and if you want to avoid reading all of them, you can just focus on this question, which is that if you look at what it takes to be innovative, what it takes to turn knowledge into action, what it actually takes to be creative, to create an unfear-ridden environment, the best single diagnostic question for a leader or organization for me is what happens when people fail. And of course, you know, this mindset, if you create this sort of like fear mindset that trying is a first step towards failure, you're in trouble, and if you kind of break this stuff down, on one hand, some organizations and some leaders create what I would call a forgive and forget culture. This is the culture that actually now I've had 2 daughters do this, that my kids want when they have their first car wreck when they're teenagers. They never want to talk about it. They just want us to repair it. But if you do that, nobody's going to learn anything, and there's no accountability. The second approach, which unfortunately is common in too many companies and organizations, is remember, blame, stigmatize, humiliate, and kick people out even for making small mistakes. Well, that may make, I guess, some of the despots out there feel better, but it creates a climate of fear where people are afraid to surface mistakes. And in fact, there's evidence that, for example, when nurse supervisors and doctors create that situation, what it does is it creates so much fear that people won't admit subsequent mistakes or try to help others correct their mistakes. So the best approach, if you can find a way to do it, is to create what research on medical mistakes describes as a forgive and remember culture, where when mistakes happen, you forgive people, you try to guide them, you get them to surface them. And also, the reason this is important is if they make the same mistakes over and over again, that's probably a sign they should be doing something else. So that's my first parting point for turning knowledge into action. My second one, some updating this. Oh, there we go. My second parting point is one that's very important for turning knowledge into action and for management in general. That there was an interesting body of research done by a guy named Rob Cross at the University of Virginia, And he looked at a whole bunch of things using a technique called social network analysis that predicted which bosses would get ahead and which ones wouldn't, and who would get the most positive performance evaluations, a whole bunch of other outcomes, who would be leading the most innovative teams and colleagues and stuff. And he ended up asking this really simple question, which is, after you talk to this person, do you have more or less energy? He asked that of the people who work with them. And what he discovered from this research was this was the strongest predictor of those things. So I sort of leave you with this, because if you're going to create an organization where people take creative ideas and actually implement them, it's your job to sort of keep that daily energy going. And you might want to think about how people feel after they talk to you. And just as a footnote, this is not an argument for charisma or for being exciting. What this is an argument for understanding the perspective of the people you lead, so you know what takes to motivate them. Okay, so with that, I'm done with my, I guess, formal presentation, and we're moving on to the next phase.
So thanks so much, Bob. My name is Carissa Little, and I'm the Director of Programs here at the Stanford Center for Professional Development. We've been delivering distance and continuing education to folks in industry for over 40 years. And so we have pretty good experience in crafting programs that resonate. And I just want to take a moment to really thank Bob for his comments. I learned something every time I sit in one of Bob's lectures, and he takes lots of complex research and really boils it down to very simple questions and tools and techniques that you can take away and do something with as a leader. And so that's very exciting. One of the things that I want to just talk about next here is that we partnered with Bob as the academic director to launch a new certificate with our center and with the Graduate School of Business called Innovation and Entrepreneurship. What's great about this is it's an online-only certificate, and what's interesting is that there's no one else out there that's offering something like this. And so you'll get the best thinking in innovation and entrepreneurship from the School of Engineering at Stanford, the Management Science and Engineering Department at Stanford, where Bob sits, as well as our colleagues over in the Graduate School of Business. And so it's really an exciting opportunity. And I also wanted to talk just a little bit about some details about the certificate. Some of the really unique aspects of it. So what's great is you can take the lectures entirely online and do them sort of at a self-paced rate, but you could also do this with some colleagues and groups if you chose to do so. We've created a new user interface for those of you who have taken courses with us before. So that's quite exciting, and so we encourage you to get in there and give us feedback. And the exercises and assignments that are there are really, it's a highly produced experience. There's lots of interactivity and lots of assignments that you have to actually go off and do something rather than just consuming content. And we'll have some TA sessions to provide feedback on assignments, as well as you can tune in and get feedback live. And so it's a different experience than we've had in the past. Couple of opportunities to come to the Stanford campus. We have the Innovation Master Series that's happening in December. For anyone that's interested in an on-campus experience, this is a nice opportunity. This course will count as a course towards the certificate program. It's sort of a special elective that we're offering through our colleagues in the Center for Design Research, and it's kind of like a best of in terms of design thinking and the art of innovation. So I just wanted to take a moment before we get to some questions and answers here. I want to encourage folks at the moment, before we finish this poll, to write in some questions, because I'm going to facilitate a Q&A session with Bob in just a couple of minutes. If you could take a moment to indicate your interest in the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Certificate that I just talked about, we would really appreciate your feedback. It's something that we take very seriously, and we'll keep the polls open for a few moments while we bring up some questions that I'd like to facilitate with Bob.
Great.
So let's take one question here. So So what is the best approach in terms of implementing innovation with very little or minimum initial capital within an organization?
So that's interesting. Well, it depends on the organization. If you're a little startup, none of them have any money, so they just start doing it. And my perspective is related to that, and there's a whole philosophy around this. Lean startup is the epitome of it, but it's been going on for a long time, of just being scrappy and going out there and finding cheap ways to test your prototype. So that's sort of like the entrepreneurship approach. The other thing, and there is sort of a line between implementation and creativity, the other thing is in large organizations, a lot of times people I see who have an impact, if they have time or space or some way or another, they just start doing it themselves. And there's this woman I know, and if I mention the name of the company, I'm not allowed to say the name of the company, you wouldn't believe this was the company, who wants to instill design thinking in her company because she thinks that the customer service in their stores is degenerating. And so what did she do? She didn't start going to her boss. She didn't ask for resources. She just made her workspace an example of what design thinking would look like. And now she's teaching workshops all over the world, this company. And this, by the way, only started about 2 or 3 months ago. And it's actually, because her concern is that they're actually losing empathy for the people who walk in the store. So to me, this is actually an innovative idea, and using design thinking is also innovative. It's actually starting to change just 3 months later. Some of the things they're doing when you walk in the store, so they have more empathy for how you feel when you walk in. And to me, now this is an extreme case of somebody who is not a high-level employee, by the way, and the way she said it is she started doing it at her desk. But now that's not always possible. There's some other organizations, I would, by the way, say, including this one, where an individual can't always have that much influence. And there's a reason that we say it's sort of the knowing-doing gap, or creativity plus implementation, that before you're going to start spreading something, you've got to have something reasonably good to spread. So when I show you the example of the roundabout at Stanford, that's actually sort of cool and something they did in a day, but most of life it's more complicated than that. Before you have something good to spread, you've got to spend more time developing it. But that's a great question, and implementation ain't easy.
That's for sure. So another great question here is, how might a mid-level manager use your advice to affect change when top management operates very differently from the examples that you shared?
So I guess this is advice for would-be revolutionary and deviants. And my perspective on that, I don't know the culture of your organization, but my perspective on that is there's sort of, I sort of do the analysis, which is, okay, so if I start doing it right away, do I get fired, in trouble, and so on? And in that case, what you probably got to do, if the price is too high of deviance, if you will, for being a revolutionary, you kind of have two choices. You either have to leave and start it on your own, or you've got to start building the little coalition where it actually can happen. So that's one sort of case. But there's some organizations, and not just the ones that have like the 15% rule or 20% rule like Google or 3M, where you can sort of do stuff in a corner and nobody will notice or you won't get caught. And in particular, there's one large German company, actually, that I worked with where this was the motto, where they would do what they called the submarine motto, which is the way that innovation got done, is you'd go below the surface and sort of take a team with you and maybe get an executive sponsor to cover for you, and nobody would admit you were actually doing it. And if you failed, then kind of everybody would die beneath the surface and nobody would mention it. But if you succeeded, what you would do would be sort of surface, and then your executive sponsor would take some credit for it, and he or she would go to his or her boss, and they would take credit for it. And so I guess the point that I'm trying to make is you've got to look at the risk that you face, you've got to look at the organizational culture you're in, and you've kind of also got to do the calculation, which is it worth it for me? And we all have different sort of risk preferences in our different cultures. But the fact is, I always like to talk about revolutionaries. Gary Hamel wrote a book about corporate revolutionaries and celebrated all these people. It's important to remember that the fate of most revolutionaries is they end up getting shot. So it's always good to have a backup plan.
That's great. So a somewhat related question is, typically upper management loves aggressive managers or sort of type A managers, but they're actually not necessarily good for innovation. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, so that's a great, yeah. So there's even some great research by this guy, Adam Grant. So this is my nomination for the next business management superstar. Adam's like all 32 years old. He's a total star, and he's been doing some research that show that essentially groups will tend to put the aggressive extroverts in charge. Those are the people who tend to nominate, but the ones that actually have calmer, more measured introverts tend to be more successful because they don't suck all the oxygen out of the room, basically. So you do have a point, and my perspective on that is, in the end, what you got to do is kind of wear them down, and eventually. And this is, in fact, Adam's even got a book that he just finished on altruism that's amazing, which is that he shows that in the short term, the aggressive, non-altruistic people are the people who get ahead initially, who take everything from themselves. But if you play the long-term game, especially if they don't get screwed by the people who are what he calls takers, and they know how to deal with them, that they tend to win in the long term. So I guess my answer to that is, if you're in an organization or in a setting where a long-term game is possible, it'll probably work. But if you're in a setting where they have a very short-term focus, probably being the aggressive, overbearing type is probably the most effective way. So part of it is picking your context. And yes, I hate to admit it, but there are many times in life by being loud and overbearing that you do gain at least short-term advantages. So for those of you who are sort of like the more pushy, aggressive, charismatic type, going into situations where there's a short-term payoff is what you should look for. Maybe that's why most venture capitalists are so obnoxious in Silicon Valley.
Hope none of your venture capital friends are tuned in.
That's what they know it.
So it sounds like a knowing-doing gap analysis will determine an organization's readiness for implementation of some idea or creative notion, as in your Stanford bike safety example. Are there any tools that can help you do this?
To determine your readiness?
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting question. My question about that is there's two things I would look at. First of all, it's almost like a frustration index, which is like the more frustrated people are, so you want them to be frustrated and impatient, but you don't want them to be depressed. So and it's that, I want to do it, I just can't stand it anymore, versus the situation. And when people are depressed, it's really a problem because they start losing hope. And I hate to say this, and one of our clients probably, but it's like they know it too. I think that this is a problem that Hewlett-Packard has. Is everybody I know who works for Hewlett-Packard is losing hope, and I actually think Meg Whitman's got one of the hardest jobs on earth. And restoring hope in turning that what used to be an impatience and frustration, turning it to that rather than sort of like depression and hopelessness is really sort of the key. So when people are sort of edging to go, that's when it really counts. I mean, a good example of this, and it's too easy an example, but it's a fun one, is I always like to talk about Brad Bird, who is the Academy Award-winning director at Pixar of Ratatouille, and most famously probably The Incredibles. When they brought him, so it was Steve Jobs, Ed Catmull, and John Lasseter, when they brought him into Pixar and told him to shake things up, he actually made The Incredibles with what he called them the black sheep. They were the people who were just pissed off at Pixar, who thought that everything was wrong. They were ready to quit, but they had that fire in the belly that it takes to close the knowing-doing gap. And in fact, I guess the key here is finding ways to create and harness energy is good. And having people who are mad is sometimes really good. The worst thing to me is when they're depressed. Because when they're depressed, they kind of don't want to do anything. So if they're depressed, try to make them mad, I guess.
That's great. So I think that's about all the time we have in terms of questions. But I just wanted to make mention that if you'd like to hear more from Bob, we're launching his Leading Innovation course as a part of the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Certificate in October, so stay tuned for that. I'm going to turn it over to Roni, who has a few closing announcements that she would like to share with you.
Thank you, Carissa. So we'd like to just let you know of a few upcoming innovation offerings that we have here with the Stanford Center for Professional Development. We will have one webinar on innovation on October 18th at 9 a.m. Pacific, which will be given by some of the faculty who are involved with our Innovation Masters series. And we will have a webinar in November given by Professor Hayagriva Rao, which is Bob's partner in the academic direction of our new certificate program for innovation and entrepreneurship. And as Carissa mentioned, we're going to have a new course launch called Leading Innovation by Bob Sutton, and it will be launching in October. So I welcome all of you to check out our website, create.stanford.edu, to find out more information about how you can enroll and apply for the certificate. And lastly, we're going to have the Innovation Master Series here on campus at Stanford in December, and you're welcome as well to enroll for that unique opportunity. So I want to thank all of you for spending this hour with us. Please know that this webinar was also recorded, and you will be receiving, everyone who was enrolled in the webinar will be receiving a link to the recording of the webinar as well as the PDF of the slides that Bob shared with us. And thank you everyone for attending.